Well, today we're continuing on those lies we believe. Last week we talked about the lie that I'm helpless. This week we're talking about the lie worthless. Yeah, a lot of people struggle with this one. That idea that says you're no good, you can't do it, you're worthless, nothing's on you. It's a struggle for a lot of people. When we struggle with worthlessness, it often is because we struggle with our true identity. And our identity is what our self-worth, our worth is determined with. Let me give you an example. Not just men, but a large part of men I talk to, they go through this problem when they stop working, they don't know who they are anymore. Not just men, but we wrap our identity in on what we do. Hi, I'm John, I'm a mechanic. Hi, I'm Susie, I'm a teacher. And our entire identity is wrapped up in what we do. Problem becomes when we say that is what happens when we lose a job, or we become sick, or injured, or that dreaded word, retire. What do you do then? You're no longer a mechanic. And so you go through this identity crisis. And you start struggling with that idea. I'm worthless. I'm no good. I'm not here. But it doesn't have to be just work. We wrap our identity up in all kinds of things. Family. How many of you went through this? You were good when your kids were home, and then your kids were no longer home. And you started saying, well, who am I now? What's my purpose now? Or maybe your identity goes back farther than that. You were convinced you were going to have kids and you were going to have children and that was going to be your life. And then something happened and you never were able to have kids. And now you're struggling with, well, I'm pointless. Or maybe you thought your identity was having children and then you got older and you said, that's not happening no more. And some of you are well past that age. And you're still, what is my life? Or my identity is found in my family, my kids. Well, they're doing this and they're doing that, and my kids are, and it's okay to be a proud parent. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when your identity is wrapped up in that, if they don't behave a certain way that you've preordained, then all of a sudden, well, I'm a worthless. I'm not a good parent. I'm a worthless human being. Or here's a popular one today, my sexual orientation. If our entire identity is wrapped up on our sexual nature, it's no wonder we see things coming out like we do. I had a student when I was teaching. And she came into my classroom. I'm teaching English at the time. And she goes, and I go, look at her. How you doing today? And her response was, I'm a lesbian. Okay, not exactly what I was asking. How are you doing? Or is that something you're struggling with? Or are you... No, I just wanted you to know. Well, that doesn't answer me how you're doing today. But for her, her whole identity was in that one word, lesbian. That was her whole identity. She was nothing but her sexual orientation. And when we boil ourselves down to such a meaning, sex is such a small part of our lives. And we say, well, that's when we boil ourselves down to our gender, our label, or whatever, it's easy to see how we can become worthless if we're not fitting into a certain mold, or we're not doing a certain activity, or we're not being, because it's our entire mold is up in that one moment. Or we become worthless. We feel like our identity is wrapped up in self. Here's another tough one, right? We get wrapped up in our own self. And our whole identity is whether we feel good or how we view ourselves. What is your self-esteem? Now, I'm not saying it's hard, you need to take, but if you're basing your opinion on how you feel, well, you're going to find days when you don't feel, where someone's going to tell you, and you're going to believe them. When our focus on self, we tend to compare ourselves to other people. Well, I am not as good as, we start saying on things like, I'm worthless because I'm not as good as, well, so-and-so. They have more than I do. We compare ourselves to other people. And so our self-worth is determined on what? Other people. Well, that ain't going to work, because there's always going to have people more than you, and there's always going to be people less than you. That's just how the world works. And as life changes, you're going to find yourself in good times and bad times, and that's how life works. When we put our identity in things, we can often feel worthless because we're comparing ourselves to the wrong things. Because we're believing the wrong things that give us this worth. We're saying, I'm worthless because my identity, what gives me worth, is flawed. And we live in a broken world. We live in a broken world. So if we have anything in this world that we're using as our identity, it's going to be broken too. But then as Christians, and I'm going to speak mostly to Christians today because we're in a church. We're not in a church. We're gathered as the church in this wonderful building. And so I'm going to speak mostly to Christians. Now, if you're not a Christian, you might find value in this as well. But I'm going to speak to Christians at this moment. As Christians, we know that Christ is supposed to be the center of our identity. We know that that's where our worth is supposed to come from. And so sometimes as Christians, however, we can feel worthless. And then you start wondering, is there something broken in me? Maybe something's broken in God. And the truth is that we all go through periods in life where you might feel like you're worthless. And you're going to have to be okay that those things it's okay not to be okay. It's not okay to stay there. But it's okay to admit that you have those feelings. It's okay to admit that you have that. When we say, oh, I never feel that way. I'm always thankful. I'm always great. We just deny life. That's like saying, well, I'm never tempted by anything. That doesn't help us. We lie to ourselves. And we don't make any progress that way. So we start to, but there are times when we feel like we're worthless. And a lot of times, as I've discovered for Christians, The reasons we know that Christ is supposed to be the center of our identity. It's something outside of this world. It's not broken, but we get a twisted view of Christ. We get a twisted view of God, and we start believing things of God that aren't true. And therefore we say, well, I'm worthless because my view of God is twisted. We start believing things like, well, God is some cosmic cop who's trying to catch me when I mess up, and you messed up, and so you're worthless. Or God is some cosmic taskmaster, and you didn't read your Bible enough, so you're worthless. Or, you missed the day of church. Or, you know what, you went to church, but you really weren't feeling it. Or, we get these views of God, and we twist them, and they get twisted, and they distort, and because we've adopted twisted views of God, we twist our views of ourselves. And these twisted views, they come from, well, let's look at 3 different places they come from. They come from childhood influences. Often I hear this, that we have, God has set up this wonderful, amazing pattern that we're supposed to follow, where the father of your house, your parent, your dad, was supposed to be your first introduction to who God is. Not that he was perfect, but he was a representation on earth to get you introduced to who God is. And some of you had wonderful fathers, and you could say, God, I know who God is because I saw my dad living it. But you know what? We're living in the 4th generation of largely absentee fathers, where fathers, and even the secular world will admit that fathers not being in the house is causing huge problems in our society. And so what we were supposed to learn from fathers, some of you didn't get that. Or maybe even worse, the person who was supposed to represent God for you was abusive or hurtful, or he was there, but he was a monster. And so your view of God, well, if God is Father, Jesus calls God Father, the first thing that pops up in your mind is the man who hurt you, or the man that abused you, or the man who wasn't there, or the man who just, was kind of like said that with his actions, you weren't worth it. My time. Oh, he might have been there, but he was always at work, and that told you, you're not worth my effort. And so the first thing that pops into your mind when you think of God is that person. Well, God must be like this. He's Father. And we've got a twisted point of view of God, because the man who was supposed to do it. Or maybe you had a mom who told you you were worthless, not by actions, maybe by action, but also by emotional neglect or unavailability. You thought, well, I'm just not worth spending time with. I'm not worth putting your love on. And it wasn't about that. It was about her dealing with her own issues, and she was trying to grow up at the same time. But you, when you were little, you don't know that. You're just feeling like, I'm not worth it. And you carry that on into the future. Or you got that relative or that family friend who always poked fun at you, made you feel like you were less than someone. Hey, fatty, what's up today? When people who ought to build you up instead are tearing us down, it's easy to start believing the lies that you're just not worth it.